What caused the spacecraft to explode this morning is the crucial question, of course. Late this afternoon, NASA official Jess Moore said there were no answers yet. He said the agency had just begun its investigation. He talked to reporters at a news conference at Cape Canaveral.
With all the delays that you experienced last week, the delay again this week, was there any pressure building at all to try to get this one off the ground? Was the pressure up there? And who made the final decision to go or no go?
There was absolutely no pressure to get this particular launch off. We have always maintained that flight safety is our top priority consideration in the program, and we look at the status and readiness of the systems based on that. We thoroughly reviewed the activities over the weekend and yesterday, and continually reviewed the status of Challenger right up until launch this morning. All of the people involved in this program, to my knowledge, felt that Challenger was quite ready to go, and I made the decision, along with the recommendation from the team supporting me, that we launch.
We received a call today from a member of an academic group who said he was on a tour group that was at the Pad 39B on Saturday night. This group was supposed to get off the bus to take a close look at the shuttle, but was not allowed to because this caller says they were told that a derrick arm had struck one of the tanks on the shuttle and that some repair work was being done. Are you aware of this incident, and are you aware of any problems at all with either the external tank or the two solid rocket boosters?
No, we looked at that on Saturday. There was not even in the same area that of the tank. It was a small box, heater box, that had about a quarter of an inch of the insulation out of 5 inches that was scraped. It was a very minor scrape. It was repaired, and everybody, all the experts in the program, took a look at that, and so we closed it off at that point in time.
Has this raised any questions about how reliable the space shuttle is? Might there just be too many things that could go wrong with a vessel this complicated?
Well, that question, I'm sure, will be asked, and I don't want to speculate on that at this point in time. That's certainly a logical question for somebody to ask.
Moore said all space shuttle operations have been suspended until, in his words, we get a handle on what happened today.
To look further at the shuttle explosion, we have Jerry Gray, publisher of Aerospace America, a trade journal and a longtime follower of the space program, and David Scott, a former astronaut who was commander of the Apollo 15 mission. He now heads his own research and development company specializing in the kind of rocket boosters used on the space shuttle. Let me ask each of you first, do you have any guess as to what could have caused this explosion today, Jerry Gray?
Well, we can all make a lot of guesses. From the appearance of the initial flame that went just before the explosion, there were probably only 3 possibilities that look at all real. One is that there could have been a rupture in one of the solid propellant rocket motor casings. A small flame does appear at the exit, what looks like the exit of the motor. I don't think this is too likely. Those cases are quite strong. The area in the nozzle that might have failed...
The solid propellant rockets are the two white ones, long cigar-shaped ones on either side.
The weakest spot in those rockets is at the nozzle juncture, and the flame seems to be upstream of that. That is in the main rocket casing.
Let us look in slow motion at the moments before the explosion and have you stop it where you see what you think is the little flame. There it is still.
There it is. See that little stop now?
The little, stop it there. You mean?
Yeah, the little flame between the big rocket at the top that's flaring and the orbiter with the tail. See, there's a little tiny orange streak down there.
Yeah, and that is not meant to be there.
No, that is definitely not meant to be there. In fact, if you watch it, it pulses back and forth for a period of about a second.
Let's advance the tape now. You can see it pulsing.
Yeah, that's it. Now, stop again.
Stop.
Now, it's not likely that that is a rupture in the solid propellant casing. The other possibility is that somehow a fracture could have occurred in the propellant tank, which is right behind that.
Yeah, the solid propellant casing is the one that is burning there, and you see it on top of our picture. And
below that is sort of the dull orange background is the tank itself, which contains a lot of hydrogen and oxygen.
Yeah.
It's possible that a rupture occurred in that tank, and that is a hydrogen flame. That's the hydrogen part of the tank is down there. We're still in the atmosphere, so that possibly hydrogen streaming out of that tank could have been ignited by the solid propellant flare, and a hydrogen flame burns fast, so that could have progressed back upstream to where you see that orange spot.
Now, let's advance the tape through to the explosion.
Okay. See it pulsing again?
Yeah.
And then it works its way around to the outside. That's due to the vortex flow around the shuttle itself, and now it just finally ignites the whole tank and goes.
Right.
Now, there's a third possibility, too,
Yeah.
and that is that somehow something happened to one of the main shuttle engines, which were right opposite that.
That's on the shuttle itself.
On the orbiter itself.
Which were, all right. Now, before we move on to that, David Scott, looking at those pictures in slow motion, does Mr. Gray's analysis of that make sense to you?
Well, I think he's chosen some possibilities that seem rational to me.
Do you agree that that flame is out of place there, that little flame that he identified?
yes,
that should not be there in
No,
normal,
that shouldn't be there.
In Sherman there. Would you care to speculate about why it would be there?
Well, I think Jerry's identified a couple of possibilities, and I think, again, the investigation team has to take a close look, because film of this sort is
shot from miles away through
away.
telescopic lenses and everything else.
And it takes some analysis in terms of telemetry they have on the ground, the flight profile, and the other aspects which may influence such a new flame.
Now, tell us about the telemetry. You mentioned this before we get on the air. Describe that. That is a stream of information coming back from many little sensors all over the spacecraft. How many of them would be recording the performance
There are
of it?
probably thousands of sensors all over the spacecraft.
And each one is sending back its own stream of information?
Pressures, temperatures, displacements, motions, and so on, and all that information is being recorded. Now, that little flame that we saw was at present for almost, probably even a little more than a second. That's a very long time for telemetry.
Is
the
it?
chances are, if there was something anomalous that were recorded by any of those sensors, they will have been recorded, and NASA's analysis would be able to identify.
I mean, how often in a second are these sensors
they're
sending back information?
They're continuous information. They're either digital or analog, but they come back on a continuous basis. A trace, such as you might see on a cardiogram, is continually coming back, recording all of the events going on in many places within the engines and other places. If the explosion were caused by something that was being monitored, then it should be able to be identified from the examination of the telemetry records. If, on the other hand, it was caused by something that might have been, that wasn't being monitored, we wouldn't know.
Now, the explosion occurred. We heard the NASA ground communicator saying it's okay for full power. They slow down, don't they, because the air pressure builds up as they're approaching orbital speed. Why do they slow the power down, or they reduce power initially right there?
Well, this is the area of what we call maximum dynamic pressure, which means that the air pressure on the vehicle, because of the thickness of the air at that altitude and the speed of the vehicle through the air, creates the maximum impact pressure, if you will, on the whole system.
So they had reduced the spacecraft's own engines down to 65% or something of power.
It's down to, well, a few percent.
A few percent. And they had just been given the okay for full power, and they had just throttled up to full power, or were throttling up. What does it tell you that this happened within a few seconds of that throttling up procedure?
Not much, because
It doesn't tell you much.
well, you're in an area of transients and dynamic changes, and you could speculate that that might have been the cause. On the other hand, I don't think there's enough information here to really make a
I heard one
speculation.
of your colleagues, Gene Cernan, an astronaut, saying today on ABC that that moment of moving from one speed to another on any engine is always a critical time. Is that? Now, does that suggest that it was possibly that your point about the spacecraft engines?
As Dave had pointed out, there are a lot of transient at that time. The increase in thrust is small. I go from, I think, 100% to 104% of thrust. So it's not a major change, but it is a change. And there can be an oscillation at that time. Now,
what does an oscillation mean?
well,
it would shake a bit.
Anytime you have a change means that there's got to be something happening. If that, for example, the propellant valve moves a fraction of an inch too far, there can be a slight pressure pulse. If this accident turns out to have been caused by the main engine, that's probably what happened. We don't know if that's the case, but it is one of the three major possibilities. A main engine failure could have flashed back and ignited the propellant coming out of the tank, as we saw, and caused the fire.
I see. Now, has this takeoff moment which in any aircraft is a critical moment, and presumably even more so here because you're dealing with such volatile fuel and in such large quantities and everything. Has that moment in the shuttle program been more dangerous than we, the public, always? Are the probabilities of risk greater than we've sort of been assuming because they've all seemed to have gone off without any hitch? Is that a dangerous moment?
Well, I think in relative terms, the shuttle is much safer than previous spacecraft. As you probably know, there's no need or capability to abort on the pad, which if you're on the launch pad within the first few seconds, I think NASA believes the shuttle is reliable enough, and I think it's been proven that you don't have to have ejection seats or other escape
The first shuttle
phenomena.
had ejection seats
Yes,
and
the
things
first,
in it.
The first floor flights had ejection seats in order to provide an extra margin of safety for
Because
the crew.
it was an untried
Sure, it was
vehicle.
a test flight.
Yeah.
But now we're in operational flights, and I think the shuttle is basically a very, very sound and safe vehicle. And for this particular occurrence, it's one of those statistical improbabilities that occurred.
But people like Senator Glenn, former astronaut, another former colleague, was saying today, we probably always thought that a day like this would come. Inherently, there was a range of risk, and was there not in these things? And that's a critical moment in that range.
Yes, and I would agree with Senator Glenn, because I think we've been very fortunate to have had the engineering expertise to get us to this point without a major failure. And
there's one other thing. I know this is all speculation, but you are very much better informed than we are about these things. Is it sensible to speculate, even, that the fact that there was a lot of ice buildup on the launch pad and on the spacecraft, which they had to clear off, that could have in any way contributed to this situation today?
It's, you know, anything is possible. There could have been any number of malfunctions. Possibly some insulation was damaged, causing a spark somewhere later. But the probability of that is really very, very low. The spacecraft is designed to operate in a very wide range of environments. In space, it's well below freezing. Liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, the propellants, are extremely cold. Icicles could have done some damage to pad systems. That is the, say, the cooling water system that douses the pad and keeps it from being burned. That's the launch pad. But it just doesn't seem likely that any icicles, unless they physically damaged the exterior of the vehicle, could have caused the problem. And I think NASA probably felt that way too, since they did a final inspection before they launched.
You are an expert in the booster engines. As I was told today and wrote in introducing you, what is the record of these engines under test circumstances and in actual flight circumstances? Do they fail?
well, I think you can see that in flight circumstances they don't, and the reliabilities are very, very high. You know, the statistical probability of failure.
We're
is
talking
low.
now about the solid propellant engines on the outside.
Either ones.
Yeah.
I think that you might say the suite of engines that NASA has on this vehicle. They have solids, they have the cryogenic main engines with hydrogen and oxygen, and they have the storable bipropellant as control thrusters and small engines on the vehicle itself. So they have all types of engines, and I think these are in some cases state-of-the-art, in some cases old engines, but they're all very highly reliable. And I think the testing process that NASA goes through is extremely intense. And they've worked out their problems in the early days, and I think the performance has been quite good.
Let us bring in a different point of view here from Thomas Gold, a professor at Cornell University, who's been a longtime critic of manned space flights, particularly the shuttle program and the planned space station. Throughout the 1960s, he was a member of the space panel of the President's Science Advisory Committee, which guided U.S. space policy. In the 70s, he testified before Congress against the then proposed shuttle program. He joins us tonight from public station WCNY in Syracuse. Professor Gold, you told us earlier today you thought this sort of thing was bound to happen. Would you explain why you thought that?
Well, I think that most people who were concerned with the space program considered that space flight is inherently dangerous. Certainly, I've said for years, unfortunately, we'll run that risk. My criticism is not now of the NASA engineers, who I think did their job extremely well. To get 24 flights off the pad and return safely was a tremendous performance. The safety record is incredibly good and much better than many people, including myself, ever thought possible. The criticism that I make is entirely whether it is necessary to subject that many people that frequently to such a risk.